In the mid-19th century, the global stage was dominated by the expansionist ambitions of Western imperial powers like Great Britain, France, and the United States. Armed with economic prowess and formidable militaries, these nations sought to spread their influence across the world, often accompanied by the missionary zeal of Christian evangelism. Embracing the ideology of free trade, they wielded their military might to enforce their agendas upon other nations. China, however, offered a unique response to this encroachment. Unlike its neighboring countries like India, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, and Vietnam, China managed to evade becoming a full-fledged colony of the West. Confucianism, the secular belief system that had long shaped China's culture and governance, did not pose the same obstacles to modernization as religions like Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism did in other regions. Yet despite this resilience, China struggled to effectively counter the growing industrialism and military dominance of the modern West. Its vast, land-based empire, governed by an ancient bureaucracy steeped in Confucian tradition, stood in stark contrast to the dynamic and industrialized European powers. This mismatch contributed to China's difficulties in dealing with foreign intrusion, leading to a cascade of challenges including unequal treaties, foreign invasions, internal rebellions, political infighting, and social unrest. The Opium Wars, starting with the first conflict in 1839–42, symbolized China's struggle to maintain sovereignty amidst the onslaught of Western imperialism. Although the Opium Wars didn't directly lead to the collapse of China's millennia-old imperial system, they marked a significant shift in Asia's power dynamics, tilting the balance in favor of the West. Prior to the Opium Wars, trade between China and the West operated under the Canton system, centered in Guangzhou or Canton. Established during the Ming Dynasty and further developed during the Qing Dynasty, this system tightly regulated foreign trade, confining it to a single port and limiting it to licensed Chinese merchants. Great Britain, for instance, engaged in a triangular trade, exchanging Indian cotton and British silver for Chinese tea and other goods. However, as demand for Chinese goods soared in Britain while British products found little market in China, a trade imbalance emerged, prompting Britain to introduce opium as a means to rectify the deficit. By the late 1700s, opium cultivation in India became a lucrative trade for Britain, effectively reversing the balance of trade in its favor by the 1820s. This economic success for Britain, however, came at a devastating cost for China, as widespread addiction to opium and the resulting social and economic disruptions laid the groundwork for China's turbulent encounters with the West in the years to come. The opium that flooded China from British India in the 19th century had a long history of medicinal and recreational use across Eurasia. However, the British East India Company, leveraging its colonial presence in India, capitalized on this substance, investing heavily in its cultivation and processing, particularly in Bengal. By establishing a profitable monopoly over opium production, the British secured a lucrative trade route to China. By the early 19th century, the recreational use of British opium was on the rise in China. However, what began as leisure soon spiraled into a crippling addiction for many. Withdrawal symptoms were severe, driving addicted individuals to desperate measures to sustain their habit. Recognizing the escalating social crisis, the Chinese government took action, first banning opium production and importation in 1800 and later outlawing its consumption in 1813, with offenders facing harsh penalties. In response to Chinese prohibition, the British East India Company employed private traders to smuggle opium into China. Chinese smugglers, in turn, facilitated distribution within the country. By 1830, the opium trade was booming, with over 100 Chinese smuggling boats operating off the coast of Guangzhou. The situation worsened in 1834, when the British East India Company lost its opium monopoly. Increased competition among dealers led to price reductions, making opium more accessible to the Chinese populace and exacerbating the problem of addiction. In just under 3 decades, opium imports skyrocketed, with shipments increasing from 4,500 chests to 40,000 by 1838. The surge in opium consumption drained China's silver reserves, with the outflow increasing from 2 million to over 9 million ounces in a decade. This dire situation was compounded when the Chinese emperor discovered that even members of his own army, government officials, and students were involved in opium smoking, further highlighting the depth of the crisis facing China. By 1836, the gravity of the opium crisis prompted the Chinese government to intensify enforcement of the 1813 ban. Opium dens were shut down, and Chinese dealers faced execution. Despite these efforts, the problem persisted and even worsened, prompting Emperor Daoguang to convene a debate among Chinese officials on how to address the crisis. Opinions within the debate were sharply divided into 2 camps. One faction advocated for a pragmatic approach, focusing on practical solutions rather than moral considerations. They proposed legalizing and taxing the production and sale of opium, believing that the resulting high prices would deter consumption. Furthermore, they argued that government taxation of the opium trade could generate revenue to address fiscal deficits and stem the outflow of silver. In contrast, led by the capable and ambitious official Lin Zexu, the opposition faction vehemently rejected this pragmatic stance. They viewed the opium trade as a moral scourge that must be eradicated at all costs. They argued that allowing the trade to continue would devastate Chinese society, leading to a loss of laborers, taxpayers, scholars, and soldiers. Instead of targeting opium users, they advocated for a crackdown on the pushers responsible for importing and selling the drug within China. For them, the issue transcended mere economics. It was a matter of preserving the moral fabric and societal integrity of the Chinese Empire. In the end, Lin Zexu's unwavering stance against the opium trade prevailed. Arriving in Guangzhou or Canton in 1839, he took charge of enforcing the ban and cracking down on opium usage. Lin launched a multi-pronged attack on the opium trade, including diplomatic efforts such as writing an open letter to Queen Victoria, questioning Britain's support for the trade and its moral implications. However, Lin's most impactful actions were on the ground. He swiftly enforced the 1813 ban by apprehending over 1,600 Chinese dealers and destroying tens of thousands of opium pipes. Additionally, he demanded that foreign companies, particularly British ones, surrender their opium supplies in exchange for tea. When the British refused, Lin halted all foreign trade and quarantined the area where foreign merchants were confined. After 6 weeks of standoff, the foreign merchants capitulated to Lin's demands, surrendering over 2.6 million pounds of opium. Lin's troops also seized and destroyed opium held on British ships, sparking controversy over whether they were anchored in international waters or Chinese territory. Lin then employed 500 Chinese men to destroy the opium by mixing it with lime and salt and dumping it into the bay. Additionally, he pressured the Portuguese, who controlled nearby Macau, to expel uncooperative British traders, ultimately forcing them to relocate to Hong Kong. These bold actions significantly escalated tensions and ultimately led to the outbreak of the First Opium War. For the British, Lin's destruction of the opium was seen as an attack on their dignity and trade principles. While some British officials advocated compensating merchants for their losses to prevent conflict, others viewed the destruction of opium as an opportunity to assert British imperial interests in China more forcefully. War erupted in November 1839, when Chinese warships clashed with British merchant vessels, marking the beginning of a protracted conflict over the opium trade and broader geopolitical ambitions. In 1839, Lin Zexu's uncompromising stance against the opium trade prevailed, leading to his arrival in Guangzhou to oversee the ban and crack down on its usage. Employing a multi-pronged approach, Lin launched a relentless assault on the opium trade. One notable action was his open letter to Queen Victoria, questioning Britain's political support for the trade and condemning the morality of drug trafficking. But Lin's most impactful efforts were on the ground. He swiftly implemented the 1813 ban by apprehending over 1,600 Chinese dealers and destroying tens of thousands of opium pipes. In a bold move, Lin demanded that foreign companies, particularly British ones, surrender their opium stocks in exchange for tea. When the British refused, Lin halted all foreign trade and imposed a quarantine on the area where foreign merchants were confined. After 6 weeks of intense standoff, the foreign merchants capitulated to Lin's demands, surrendering a staggering 2.6 million pounds of opium, equivalent to over 20,000 chests. Lin's forces also confiscated and destroyed the opium held on British ships, despite disputes over their location. British authorities claimed they were in international waters, while Lin asserted they were within Chinese territory. Undeterred, Lin mobilized 500 Chinese laborers to dispose of the seized opium by mixing it with lime and salt before dumping it into the bay. Furthermore, he exerted pressure on the Portuguese, who controlled nearby Macao, to expel the uncooperative British, compelling them to relocate to the island of Hong Kong. Lin Zexu's resolute actions against the opium trade not only demonstrated his unwavering commitment to combating addiction and defending China's sovereignty, but also sparked a significant confrontation with Western powers, setting the stage for the tumultuous events of the First Opium War. The culmination of Lin Zexu's actions set the stage for heightened tensions that ultimately ignited the First Opium War. For the British, Lin's bold move to destroy the opium reserves was perceived as a direct challenge to British honor and trade principles. Over the years, British merchants, smugglers, and the East India Company have criticized China's stance on trade, arguing that it hinders the free flow of commerce practiced by civilized nations. In response to Lin's actions, British representatives in Guangzhou proposed a compromise. Merchants would surrender their opium to Lin in exchange for compensation from the British government. The aim was to avoid a major conflict and safeguard the interests of merchants and ship captains while resuming lucrative trade in other goods. However, the immense value of the confiscated opium, coupled with mounting pressure from merchants in China, India, and London demanding restitution for their losses, provided British politicians with the pretext they needed to assert imperial interests in China more forcefully. The situation escalated in November 1839, when clashes erupted between Chinese warships and British merchant vessels, marking the beginning of hostilities. The destruction of the opium reserves, coupled with long-standing grievances over trade practices, propelled Great Britain towards a military confrontation with China, ultimately leading to the outbreak of the First Opium War. In June 1840, a formidable British fleet, comprising 16 warships and merchant vessels, arrived in Guangzhou, equipped in part by Jardine Matheson and Company, the primary British opium producer. Over the following 2 years, British forces launched assaults on forts, engaged in battles, captured cities, and attempted diplomatic negotiations. Despite initial resistance from Chinese troops, armed with outdated weaponry and limited naval resources, they proved largely ineffective against the superior firepower of the British Marines, steamships, and merchant vessels. The British bombardment of Guangzhou Canton stands as a stark reminder of the asymmetrical conflict. The aftermath of the First Opium War saw China sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 under duress. This treaty granted significant advantages to Britain, including the acquisition of Hong Kong as a strategic deep-water port, substantial indemnities to be paid to the British government and merchants, and the establishment of 5 new treaty ports where British merchants and their families could reside. Additionally, British citizens in these ports were granted extraterritorial rights, subjecting them to British law rather than Chinese jurisdiction. Moreover, the treaty included a most favored nation clause, ensuring that any concessions granted to other foreign powers would automatically extend to Britain. Conversely, the Treaty of Nanjing offered no tangible benefits to China. Despite the war's end, the opium trade continued to thrive, with imports peaking at 87,000 chests in 1879. While opium imports eventually declined and ceased during World War I due to increased domestic production within China, other aspects of trade failed to meet foreign merchants' expectations, leading to ongoing discontent directed at the Chinese government. Internally, the aftermath of the war precipitated a bitter political divide among Chinese officials. Two factions emerged. The peace faction, aligned with the users faction in the opium trade debate, advocated for conciliatory approaches. In contrast, the war faction, aligned with the pushers faction, favored aggressive responses. Despite nominal control by the peace faction, political tensions simmered within China, reflecting the enduring repercussions of the First Opium War. Following the Treaty of Nanjing, which marked the end of the Canton system established in the 17th century, China entered into a series of unequal treaties with Western powers starting in 1844. These treaties, facilitated by most favored nation clauses, granted Westerners the right to construct churches and propagate Christianity within the treaty ports. Thus, the First Opium War and its consequential treaties heralded a significant victory for Western imperialism and free trade in China. Upon the death of the Chinese emperor in 1850, his successor sidelined the peace faction in favor of those aligned with Lin Zexu's policies. Efforts to recall Lin from exile were thwarted by his untimely demise en route. Meanwhile, the Chinese court's reluctance to receive foreign diplomats in Beijing and its limited compliance with the treaties disappointed Western powers. The outbreak of the Second Opium War in 1856 further exacerbated tensions. Lasting until 1860, this conflict culminated in the capture of Beijing by British and French forces. The subsequent imposition of new unequal treaties compelled China to open an additional 11 treaty ports and pay further indemnities. Moreover, this period saw a surge in Christian missionary activities and the legalization of the opium trade, amplifying the impact of Western influence in China. Despite the opening of new ports to British merchants following the First Opium War, China hesitated to implement the agreements, resulting in limited legal trade. British merchants, eager for expanded opportunities, pressured their government to take action. However, the British government faced obstacles due to restrictions imposed by the Chinese government in Beijing on whom it would engage. In October 1856, tensions escalated when Chinese authorities arrested the Chinese crew of a British-operated ship. Viewing this as an opportunity to push for further concessions, the British initiated military pressure on China to open up more to British merchants and trade. France, motivated by the execution of a French Christian missionary in China, joined forces with Britain. Together, they captured Guangzhou and advanced northward to Tianjin. Although China agreed to a series of Western demands outlined in documents like the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858, they refused to ratify these treaties, leading to continued hostilities. In 1860, British and French troops landed near Beijing and breached the city's defenses. Negotiations faltered, prompting the British High Commissioner to order the looting and destruction of the Imperial Summer Palace, a symbol of Qing Dynasty authority. Subsequently, the Chinese emperor fled to Manchuria while his brother negotiated the Convention of Beijing. This treaty ratified the Treaty of Tianjin, imposed further indemnities, and ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain. The war concluded with a significantly weakened Qing Dynasty, compelling China to reassess its relations with the outside world and embark on reforms to modernize its military, political, and economic structures. In 1839, Britain thrust its version of free trade upon China, insisting on the legal rights of British citizens to conduct business freely, regardless of location. Critics in China pointed out the hypocrisy of Britain advocating for free trade while promoting an illegal product, opium, within its own borders. Opinions vary on the primary motivation behind Britain's involvement in the Opium Wars. Some argue that it was about upholding the principle of free trade, while others contend that Britain sought to protect its international reputation amidst challenges in other regions. American historians suggest that the conflicts aimed to expand commercial relations broadly and dismantle the Canton trading system. Additionally, some posit that the war aimed to maintain China's trade deficit, with opium serving as an effective tool despite its detrimental effects on Chinese society. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to World History Explore for more content like this. Now here's something for you to think about. How did the Opium Wars shape China's perception of itself and its interactions with the Western world? Drop your insights in the comments below. As always, your suggestions for future videos are highly valued. Until next time, take care